The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. In the bosom of one of those spacious coves which indent the eastern shore of the Hudson, there lies the small market town or rural port, which by some is known as Greensburg, but is more widely and properly known by the name of Tarrytown. This name was given in former days, we are told, by the good housewives of the adjacent country for the inveterate propensity of their husbands to linger about the village tavern on market days. Be that as it may, I do not vouch for the fact, but merely advert to it for the sake of being precise and authentic. Not far from this town, perhaps about 2 miles, there is a small valley, or rather a lack of land among high hills, which is one of the quietest places in the whole world. A small brook glides through it with just murmur enough to lull one to repose, and the whistling of a quail or tapping of a woodpecker is perhaps the only sound that ever breaks in among the uniform tranquility. From the listless repose of this place and the peculiar nature of its inhabitants, who are descended from the original Dutch settlers, this sequestered glen has long been known by the name of Sleepy Hollow, and its rustic lads are known as the Sleepy Hollow Boys throughout all the neighboring country. A drowsy, dreamy influence seems to hang in the air and pervade the very atmosphere. Some say the place was bewitched by a high German doctor during the early days of the settlement. Others that an old native chief, the prophet or wizard of his tribe, held his powwows there before the land was discovered by Master Hendrik Hudson. Certain it is the place continues under the sway of some witching influence, causing the people to walk in a constant state of reverie. They are given to all kinds of marvelous beliefs and superstitions. They see sights and have trances and hear music and voices in the air. The neighborhood abounds with haunted tales, twilight spots, and local superstitions. Stars shoot and meteors glare oftener across the sky than in any other part of the country. And the nightmare, with her whole ninefold, seems to make it the favorite scene of her gambols. The dominant spirit that haunts this enchanted region and is said to be the commander-in-chief of all the powers of the air is the apparition of a figure on horseback without a head. It is said by some to be the ghost of a Hessian trooper whose head was carried away by a cannonball during the early days of the Revolutionary War. His haunts are not confined to the valley, but extend at times to the adjacent country roads, and especially to the vicinity of a church at no great distance. Local beliefs allege that the body of the trooper, having been buried in the churchyard, that the ghost rides forth in nightly quest to the scene of battle in search of his head, and that the rushing speed with which he travels along the hollow like a midnight blast is owing to his being belated and in a hurry to get back to the churchyard before daybreak. I mention this peaceful spot with all possible laud, for it is in such little retired Dutch communities embosomed here and there in the great state of New York that populations, manners, and customs remain fixed, while the great torrent of migration and improvements, which is making such incessant changes in other parts of this restless country, it sweeps by them unobserved. They are like those little nooks of still water that border a rapid stream where we may see the straw and bubble riding quietly at anchor, undisturbed by the rushing current. Though many years have elapsed since I trod the drowsy shades of Sleepy Hollow, I wonder whether I should not still find the same families and trees vegetating in its sheltered bosom. In a remote period of American history, that is to say, some 30 years since, there was a worthy wight by the name of Ichabod Crane, who sojourned, or as he expressed it, tarried in Sleepy Hollow for the purpose of instructing the children of the vicinity. He was a native of Connecticut, a state which supplies the Union with pioneers for the forest, as well as for the mind, and sends forth yearly its legions of frontier woodsmen and schoolmasters. The cognomen of Crane was, well, it was not inapplicable to his appearance. He was tall, but exceedingly lank, with narrow shoulders, long arms and legs. His feet, well, they might have served for shovels, and his hands dangled a mile out of his sleeves, and his whole frame most loosely hung together. His head was small and flat at top, with huge ears and large green glassy eyes, with a long sniped nose that, perched upon his spindle neck, made him appear as though he were a weathercock to tell which way the wind would blow. To see him striding along the profile of a hill on a windy day, with his clothes bagging and fluttering about him, one might have mistaken him for the genius of famine descended upon the earth, or of some scarecrow eloped from his cornfield. His schoolhouse was a low building, rudely constructed of logs, and one large room. The windows were partly glazed and partly patched by leaves of old copybooks, and it was most ingeniously secured at vacant hours by a withe twisted in the handle of the door, with stakes set against the window shutters, so that, well, though a thief might get in with perfect ease, he would have some embarrassment getting out. An idea most probably borrowed by the architect Joost van Houten from The Mystery of an Eel Pot. The schoolhouse stood in a rather lonely but pleasant situation, just at the foot of a woody hill, with a small brook running close by and a large birch tree growing at one end of it. From hence the low murmur of his pupils' voices could be heard conning over their lessons on a drowsy summer's day, like the hum of a beehive, interrupted now and then by the authoritative voice of the master in a tone of menace, or peradventure by the appalling sound of the birch as he urged some tardy loiterer along the flowery path of knowledge. Truth to say, he was a conscientious man, and ever bore in mind that golden maxim, spare the rod and spoil the child. Ichabod Crane's scholars certainly were not spoiled. I would not have it imagined, however, that he was one of those cruel potentates of the school who joyed at the smarting of his subjects. On the contrary, he administered justice with discrimination rather than severity, taking the burden off the backs of the weak and laying it on those of the strong. Your mere puny stripling that winced beneath the slightest flourish of the rod was passed by with indulgence. But the claims of justice were satisfied by inflicting a double portion on some tough-headed, broad-skirted Dutch urchin who sulked and swelled and grew dogged and sullen beneath the birch. All this he called doing his duty by their parents, and he never inflicted a chastisement without following it by the assurance that they would remember it and thank him for it the longest day they had to live. When school hours were over, he was often the companion and playmate of some of the larger children, and on holiday afternoons would accompany some of the smaller ones home who happened to have pretty sisters or good housewives for mothers noted for the comforts of the cupboard. Indeed, it behooved him to keep on good terms with his pupils, for the revenue arising from his schoolhouse was scarce, and would barely have been enough to furnish him with daily bread, for he was a huge feeder. And though lank, he had the dilating powers of an anaconda. So, to help out his maintenance, he was, according to country custom in those parts, boarded and lodged with the families whose children he instructed. With this, he lived successfully a week at a time, with all of his belongings tied up in a little cotton handkerchief. Among his other vocation, he was also the singing master of the vicinity, and picked up many bright shillings by instructing the local folk in psalmody. It was of no small bit of vanity to him to take up his station at the center of the church gallery with a band of chosen singers around him, where in his own mind he completely carried the palm from the parson. Certain it is his voice resounded far above the rest, and there are peculiar quavers still to be heard in that church, quite half a mile off, just to the opposite side of the mill pond, that are said to be directly descended from the nose of Ichabod Crane. Thus, by diverse little makeshifts, the worthy pedagogue got on tolerably enough, and was thought by all who understood nothing of the labor of headwork to have a wonderfully easy life of it. From his half-itinerant life, too, he was a kind of traveling gazette, carrying the whole budget of local gossip with him from house to house, so that his appearance was always greeted by satisfaction. It was of no small bit of vanity and pride to him that he found himself in the smiles of all the country damsels. The schoolmaster is generally revered by the women folk, for he had read several books quite through, and he was a perfect master of Cotton Mather's A History of New England Witchcraft, in which, by the way, he most firmly and potently believed. When school hours were over, it was often his great pleasure to stretch himself on the rich bed of clover that bordered his schoolhouse, and there con over old Mather's direful tales until the printed page became a mere mist before his eyes. Then, as he wended his way by swamp and stream and awful woodland to the farmhouse where he happened to be quartered, every sound of nature at that witching hour startled an already excited imagination. The moan of the whippoorwill, the hooting of the screech owl, the boding cry of the tree toad, the fireflies, too, with one of uncommon brightness, should it stream across his path, while the poor varlet was about ready to give up the ghost. And should some blockhead of a beetle blunder up against the side of the poor schoolmaster's head, well, the poor varlet was nearly done in with the thought that he had been struck by a witch's token. His only resource on such occasion, whether to drown thought or drive away evil spirits, was to sing psalm tunes to himself. And the good people of Sleepy Hollow were often filled with awe at hearing his sweet nasal melody, long drawn out. Among his other fearful pleasures was to spend long winter evenings with the old Dutch wives as they sat spinning by their fire, and with a row of apples roasting and spluttering along the hearth, and there listen to their tales of ghosts and goblins, witches, and haunted fields, haunted brooks, haunted houses, haunted trees, known to the vicinity of Sleepy Hollow, and particularly of the tales of the Headless Horseman, or Galloping Hessian of the Hollow, as they sometimes referred to him. But if there was a pleasure in all of this, while snugly cuddling in a warm chimney corner that was all of a ruddy glow, and where, of course, no specter should dare show his face, it was dearly purchased by his subsequent walk homewards. What fearful shapes and shadows beset his path on the dim and snowy night! How often did he cringe away from a shrub sheeted with snow that had appeared as a specter before his path, and how often did he cringe at the sound of his own footsteps on the frosty crust beneath his feet, and dare never to look over his shoulder, lest he should see some uncouth being tramping close behind him. And how often was he thrown into complete terror by the sound of some rushing blast through the trees, with the thought that it was the Galloping Hessian on one of his nightly scourings. All these, of course, were terrors of the night, phantoms that walk in darkness. And though he had been more than once beset by Satan in diverse shapes, yet daylight brought an end to all these evils, and he would have passed a pleasant life of it, in spite of the devil in all his works, if his path had not been crossed by a being that causes more perplexity to mortal man than ghosts, goblins, and the entire race of witches put together, and that was a woman. Among the disciples to gather one evening for his instruction in psalmody was Katrina Van Tassel, the daughter and only heiress of a substantial Dutch farmer. She was a blooming lass, a fresh 18, plump as a partridge, bright, melting, and rosy-cheeked as one of her father's prized peaches. She was famed not merely for her beauty, but also for her vast expectations, and was withal of a coquette, as might have been perceived even in her dress, which was a mixture of ancient and modern fashions that were best suited to set off her charms. She wore the ornaments of pure yellow gold, which were passed down through her family from the old country, and withal a provokingly short petticoat to display the prettiest foot and ankle in the whole country round. Ichabod had a soft and foolish heart for the sex, and it is no surprise that so tempting a morsel soon found favor in his eye. Moreover, after he visited her and her paternal estate, old Baltus Van Tassel was a thriving, liberal-hearted, contented old soul. He seldom, it is true, set either his sights or his thoughts beyond the limits of his own farm, but within those, everything was snug, happy, and well-conditioned. He was satisfied with his wealth, though not proud of it, and piqued himself on the hearty abundance rather than the style in which he lived. The pedagogue's mouth watered as he looked upon Van Tassel's sumptuous array of luxurious winter fare. In his devouring mind's eye, he pictured to himself every roasting pig running about with a pudding in its belly and an apple in his mouth. The pigeons were snugly put to bed with a coverlet of crust, and the ducks were paired cozily in dishes with a decent competency of onion sauce. In the porkers, he saw the future sleek sides of bacon and juicy relishing ham, and not a turkey he beheld but daintily trussed up with a gizzard under its wing, and peradventure a necklace of savory sausages. And beyond those, he saw the rich fields of yellow corn, of buckwheat, and orchards burdened with ruddy fruit that all surrounded the warm tenement of Van Tassel. From the moment Ichabod eyed these regions of delight, the peace of his mind was at an end, and his only study was how to gain the affections of the peerless daughter of Van Tassel. In this endeavor, however, he had more to contend with than generally fell to the lot of a knight-errant of yore, who seldom had anything more than giants, enchanters, and fire-breathing dragons and other easily conquered foes to contend with, and had to make his way merely through gates of iron and brass and over walls of adamant to the castle keep, where the lady of his heart was confined, all which he achieved as easily as a man carves his way to the center of a Christmas pie. And then the lady, and as a matter of course, Ichabod, however, had to win his way to the heart of a coquette, and had to encounter adversaries of real flesh and blood, the numerous rustic admirers that beset every pathway to her heart, keeping a watchful and angry eye upon each other, but ready to fly out in the common cause should any newcomer arise. Among these, the most formidable was a burly, roaring, roistering blade by the name of Abraham, or according to the Dutch abbreviation, Bram van Brunt, the hero of the country round, renowned for his great feats of strength and hardihood. He was broad-shouldered and double-jointed, with short, black, curly hair and a bluff, but not unpleasant countenance. From his great Herculean frame and powers of limb, he earned the nickname Brom Bones, by which he was universally known. He was renowned for great knowledge and skill in horsemanship, being as dexterous on horseback as a Tartar, and with the ascendancy in a rustic life that strength always yields, he was the umpire in all disputes, setting his hat on one side and making a decision that showed of no favoritism or gainsay with the other. He was always ready for either a fight or a frolic, but he had more mischief than ill will in his composition, and there was a good dash of waggish good humor at the bottom of it. He was revered by the common folk with a mixture of awe, admiration, and goodwill, and when any madcapped prank or rustic brawl occurred in the vicinity, well, they all simply shook their heads and warranted, Brom Bones is at the bottom of it. This rantipole hero had for some time singled out the blooming Katrina as the object of his uncouth gallantries, and though his gentle caresses and endearments were not unlike those of a bear, it was whispered that she did not altogether discourage his hopes. Certain it is, his advances were signal for other rival to retire, having no inclination to cross a lion in his moors, insomuch that when his horse was seen tied to Van Tassel's palings on a Sunday night, a sure sign that his master was within, courting, or as it is termed, sparking within, all other suitors retired and carried the war into other quarters. Such was the formidable candidate with whom Ichabod had to contend. And a stouter man would have shrunk from the competition, and a wiser man would have despaired. But Ichabod was a strong mixture of pliability and perseverance, yielding but tough like a supplejack. Though he bent beneath the slightest pressure, the moment it was away, jerk! He carried himself as erect and carried his head as high as ever. To have taken the field openly against his rival would have been madness, for he was not a man to be thwarted in his amours any more than that stormy lover Achilles. Ichabod, therefore, made his advances in a quiet and gently insinuating manner. Under the cover of his character of singing master, he made frequent visits to the farmhouse. Not that he had anything to apprehend from the meddlesome interference of parents, which is so often a stumbling block in the path of lovers. Old Baltus Van Tassel loved his daughter even better than his pipe, and like a good man and excellent father, he let her have her way in everything. Thus, while honest Balt sat at one end of the piazza, smoking his evening pipe, Ichabod carried suit with the daughter, sauntering along in the twilight, that hour most favorable to the lover's eloquence. I profess not to know how women's hearts are wooed and won. To me, they have always been matters of riddle and admiration. Some seem to have 1,000 doors of access or points of entry, while others have but a single point or single door of entry. It is a great triumph of skill to maintain possession of the former, but still greater proof of generalship to maintain possession of the latter, for man must battle for his fortress at every door and window. He who wins 1,000 common hearts is indeed entitled to some renown. But he who holds undisputed sway over the heart of a coquette is indeed a hero. This was evidently not the case with the redoubtable Brom Bones. For the moment Ichabod made his advances known, the interest of the former evidently declined. His horse was no longer seen tied to the palings of Van Tassel's on a Sunday night, and a deadly feud now arose between he and the preceptor of Sleepy Hollow. Brom, who had a degree of rustic chivalry about his nature, would have fain carried matters to open warfare and settled their pretensions to the lady thus by single combat, but Ichabod was too wary of the superior might of his adversary, and he had overheard the boast of Bones that he would double that schoolmaster up and lay him on the shelf of his own schoolhouse, and he was too conscious to give him an opportunity. He left Brom no alternative but to draw on his funds of rustic waggery and play off boorish practical jokes upon the schoolmaster. He harried his otherwise peaceful domains, he smoked out his singing school by stopping up the chimney, and he broke into the schoolhouse, despite its formidable fastenings of withe-in window stakes, and turned everything topsy-turvy, so that the poor varlet began to think that all the witches of the country held their meetings there. But what was still most annoying, Brom took all manner and opportunity of turning his rival into ridicule in the presence of his mistress, and had a scoundrel dog whom he taught to whine in the most ludicrous fashion, and introduced him as a rival of Ichabod's to instruct her in psalmody. In this way, matters continued for some time, without producing any material effect on the relative situation of the contending powers. On a fine autumnal day, Ichabod sat enthroned upon the lofty stool from whence he usually looked over his little literary realm, when suddenly the quiet study of his pupils was interrupted by the appearance of a messenger with an invitation to Ichabod to attend a quilting frolic or merrymaking to be held that evening at the castle of Irvantassel. All was now bustle and hubbub in the late quiet schoolroom. The students were hurried through their lessons. Those who were nimble skipped over half with impunity, while those who were tardy had a smart application in the rear to help them over a tall word. Books were flung aside, inkstands were overturned, benches were thrown down, and the whole schoolhouse was turned loose an hour before its usual time. Ichabod now spent at least an extra half hour in his toilet, brushing up his best, and indeed only suit of rusty black, and arranged his locks by a broken piece of looking glass that hung up in the schoolhouse, that he might make his appearance before his mistress in the true style of a cavalier. He borrowed a horse from the old Dutch farmer with whom he was domiciliated, Hans von Ripper, and thus gallantly mounted, issued forth like a knight errant in quest of adventure. It is meet that I should, in the true style of romantic story, give some description of the appearance of my hero and his steed. The creature that he bestrode was a broken-down old plow horse that had outlived everything but its viciousness. He was gaunt and shagged, with a ewe-neck and head like a hammer. His mane and tail were knotted and covered in burrs. One eye had lost its pupil and was glaring and spectral, but the other had the gleam of a genuine devil in it. Still, we have to assume he had fire and metal, if we may assume by the name he bore of gunpowder. Ichabod was a suitable rider for such a steed. He rode with short stirrups which brought his knees nearly up to the pommel of the saddle, and he carried the whip perpendicular in his hand, with his elbows stuck out like those of a grasshopper, and as he jogged along, the flapping of his arms was not unlike that of a pair of wings. The tails of his coat fluttered out almost to the ends of the horse's tail, and he wore a small wool cap which rested on the bridge of his nose, or so the scanty strip of his forehead might be called. Such was the appearance of my hero and his steed as he issued forth from the gate of Hans von Ripper. As I have mentioned, it was that jolly time of autumn, and as Ichabod jogged slowly along the banks of the Hudson, he was surrounded by the culinary symptoms of that happy time of year. All around him he took in the sights of the vast stores of apples, some hanging in oppressive opulence in the trees, some were heaped up in baskets destined for the marketplace, and some piled high on the ground for the cider press. And beyond those he saw the rich fields of corn and buckwheat with their ears peeking out towards the sun, and beneath those the great round pumpkins with their bellies turned towards the sun, all hinting at the promise of hasty puddings, pies, flapjacks, all prepared by the delicate, dimpled hand of Katrina Van Tassel. It was towards evening that Ichabod arrived at the castle of Ir Van Tassel, which he found thronged with the pride and flower of the adjacent country, the old Dutch farmers, a spare and leathern-faced race, in homespun clothes and handmade ornaments. The daughters, well, were almost as antiquated as their mothers, excepting where a fine ribbon, a white frock, or straw hat gave symptoms to city innovation. The sons were in their short, square-skirted coats with stupendous brass buttons and buckles, their hair styled and queued up in the style of the time, especially if they could procure an eel skin for the purpose, it noted as being a nourisher and strengthener of the hair. Brom Bones, however, was the hero of the scene, having come to the occasion on his favorite steed, Daredevil, a creature like himself, full of mischief and mayhem that kept the rider in constant fear of his neck. Indeed, he was noted as preferring wild, unbroken creatures, for he beheld tractable, well-behaved steeds as unworthy of a lad of spirits. Fain would I pause to dwell upon the world of charms that burst upon the enraptured gaze of my hero as he entered the state parlor of Van Tassel. Not of the bevy of buxom lasses with their luxurious displays of red and white, but the ample charms of a genuine Dutch tea table in that happy, jolly, delicious time of autumn. Such heaped up dainties known to only the most experienced Dutch wives. There was the doughty donut, the tender olykoek, the crisp and crumbling cruller, and then there were sweet cakes and shortcakes and honey cakes and ginger cakes and a whole family of cakes, and then there were peach pies and pumpkin pies and bowls of pears, plums, quinces, broiled shad, roast chicken, roast beef, sliced ham, turkey, beside bowls of milk and cream mingled together, all higgledy-piggledy, pretty much as I have enumerated them. Heaven bless the mark. I want breath and time to describe this bounty as it deserves. But I am too eager to get on with my story. Fortunately, Ichabod was in no such hurry, but did ample service to sample every dainty. He was a kind and thankful creature whose spirits rose with eating, as some men's do with drink. He could not help, too, rolling his great green eyes as he ate and chuckling to himself how he might one day be lord of all this almost indescribable luxury and splendor. Then he thought how soon he'd turn his back on the old schoolhouse and snap his fingers in the face of Hans von Ripper or any other itinerant pedagogue that should dare to call him comrade. Then the sound of music summoned to the common room or hall. The musician was an old gray-haired man who had been the itinerant orchestra of the community for more than half a century. His instrument was as old and battered as himself, and the better part of the time he scraped on 2 or 3 strings, bowing his head almost to the floor, only to stomp his foot when a new couple was to start. Ichabod prided himself upon his dancing as much as upon his vocal powers. Not a limb, not a fiber about him was idle. To have seen him gallivanting about with all his limbs and clothes fluttering around him, you would have thought that St. Vitus, that blessed patron of the dance, was figuring before you in person. How, then, could the flogger of urchins be otherwise animated and joyous? The lady of his heart was his partner in the dance, and smiling graciously at all of his amorous oglings, while Brom Bones, sorely smitten with love and jealousy, sat brooding by himself in a corner. When the dance was at an end, Ichabod was attracted to a knot of the sager folk, who, with old Van Tassel, sat smoking at one end of his piazza, and there chatted over former times and long drawn-out tales about the war. But in time, the subjects all turned to that favorite topic of Sleepy Hollow, that of the ghosts and goblins known to the vicinity. Tales were told of funeral trains, mourning cries, and wailings heard about the tree famous for Major Andre. Tales were also told of the woman in white, said to haunt Raven Rock, who can be heard shrieking out on snowy nights, having perished in the snow herself. But eventually, the stories all turned to that favorite specter of Sleepy Hollow, the headless horseman, who had been heard several times of late and was known to tie his horse among the gravestones in the churchyard. The tale was told of old Brower, a most heretical disbeliever in ghosts and goblins, how he met the midnight trooper on returning from his recent foray into Sleepy Hollow, how they galloped together over bush, brake, swamp, and stream until they reached the church bridge, when the Hessian turned into a skeleton, threw old Brower into a brook, and disappeared over the treetops with a clap of thunder. This tale was immediately matched by a thrice marvelous tale by Brom Bones, who made light of the galloping Hessian as just an errant jockey. Why, he affirmed that on returning from his recent foray into the neighboring village of Sing Sing, that he was overtaken by the midnight trooper, that he challenged him to a bowl of punch, and he should have won it soundly too, for Daredevil beat the goblin horse all hollow. But just as they reached the church bridge, the Hessian bolted and disappeared in a flash of fire and brimstone. All these tales, told in that manner, with which men speak in the dark, the listeners only now and then responding with the occasional gleam of a pipe, now sank deep into the mind of Ichabod Crane. The revel now gradually broke up. The old farmers gathered together their families and could be heard clattering over the distant hills in their wagons, their voices slowly dying away. Ichabod alone lingered behind, hoping, according to the custom of country lovers, to have a tete-a-tete with the heiress, believing that he was now on the high road to success. What passed at this interview, I cannot say, for in fact, I do not know, but something, I fear me, must have gone wrong, for he certainly carried forth after no great interval with the air of a man quite desolate and chapfallen. Oh, these women! Could that girl have been playing off any of her coquettish tricks? Were her advances all a sham to secure the conquest of his rival? Heaven only knows, not I. Suffice to say, he stole forth with the air of one who is sacking a hen roost, rather than a fair lady's heart, and without looking at the scenes of rural wealth on which he'd so often gloated, made his way directly to the church, to the stable, where with several hearty cuffs and kicks, raised his steed most uncourteously from the comfortable quarters where he'd been sleeping. It was the very witching time of night that Ichabod, heavy-hearted and crestfallen, began his pursuit homewards over the rolling hills which rise above Tarrytown, in which he had traversed so cheerily in the afternoon. The hour was as dismal as himself. In the dead hush of midnight, he could hear the watchdog barking from the opposite shore of the Hudson, but it was so vague and faint that it only gave an idea of the distance between he and the faithful companion of man. No signs of life occurred around him, except the occasional melancholy chirp of a cricket or guttural twang of a bullfrog as if turning uncomfortably suddenly in his sleep in some nearby marsh. The hour grew darker and darker. The stars sank deeper into the night sky, and driving clouds occasionally hid them from his sight. He had never felt more lonely and dismal. It was at this moment that all the stories of ghosts and goblins which he'd heard in the afternoon now came crowding upon his recollection. He was, moreover, approaching the scene where many of the stories had been laid. At the center of the road stood an enormous tulip tree that towered like a giant among the rest. Its limbs were gnarled and fantastic, wide enough that they could have served for trunks to regular trees. They twisted down almost to the earth, only to rise back up into the air. It was tied with the tragical tale of the unfortunate Major Andre, who had been captured hard by. And fearful is the schoolboy who must pass it alone after dark. The local people revered it with a mixture of respect and superstition, partly due to the fate of its ill-starred namesake, and partly due to the woeful lamentations told concerning it. As Ichabod approached this fearful tree, he began to whistle. He thought his whistling was answered. He ceased and quickly discovered it was but a blast blowing through the dry branches. But as he approached a little nearer, he thought he saw something white hanging in the midst of the tree. But on peering more closely, realized it was but where some lightning had struck the tree and the white wood was laid bare. But then he heard a moan. His teeth chattered. His knees smote against the sides of the saddle, for it was but one bough rubbing against another in the breeze. Ichabod passed the fearful tree in safety, but new perils now lay before him. About 200 yards beyond the tree, there is a small brook which crosses the road and runs into a marshy glen known as Wiley's Swamp. A few rough logs thrown side by side serve as a kind of bridge over it. To cross this bridge was now the severest trial, for it was at this identical location that the unfortunate Andre was captured, and fearful is the schoolboy that must cross it alone after dark. His heart began to thump, but Summoning up all his courage, he gave his horse half a score of kicks and attempted to dash briskly across. The perverse old animal made a lateral move, however, and he ran broadside into a fence. Ichabod, whose fears rose with the delay, jerked the reins in the other direction, and the horse began, it was true, but it was only to plunge to the opposite side, where he ran into a thicket of brambles and alder bushes. The troubled pedagogue now bestowed both whip and heel upon the ribs of old Gunpowder, who dashed forward with a suddenness, only to come to an equal stop at the foot of the bridge that nearly sent his rider sprawling. Just at that moment, a plashy tramp caught the sensitive ear of Ichabod. From the dark shadow of the grove just at the foot of the bridge emerged a figure, towering, misshapen, and massive. It stirred not, but seemed gathered up in the gloom of the darkness. The hair of the affrighted pedagogue stood on end. What was to be done? To turn and fly now surely was too late, if it were ghost or goblin, which could ride on the very wings of the wind. Summoning up, therefore, a show of courage, he demanded in stammering accents, Who are you? He received no reply. He repeated his demands. Sir, I demand to know, who are you? Still, he received no reply. Once more, he cudgeled the sides of the inflexible Gunpowder and broke forth with an involuntary fervor into a psalm tune. At that moment, the shadowy figure of alarm put itself into motion and stood at once at the center of the road. Though the night was dark and dismal, the form of the figure might now be ascertained. It appeared to be a horseman of towering proportions, riding a steed of a powerful frame. Made no offer of molestation or sociability, but he kept aloof, jogging on the blind side of old Gunpowder. His heart began to sink within him. Having no relish for this midnight companion, Ichabod quickened his steed in hopes of leaving the traveler behind. But the other quickened his horse to an equal pace. Ichabod pulled up and fell into a walk, hoping to let the traveler pass, but the other did the same. His heart began to sink within him. There was something in the moody and dogged silence of this pertinacious companion that was mysterious and appalling. On mounting a rising ground which brought the figure in relief against the night sky, Ichabod was horror-struck on discovering that the rider was indeed headless. But his fears rose even greater still when he discovered that the head, which should have rested on its shoulders, was carried before him on the pommel of his saddle. Nope! Ichabod's fears rose to desperation, and he rained a shower of kicks on old Gunpowder, hoping by sudden movement to give the rider the slip. But the specter started full jump with him. Away they dashed over swamp and stream, stones flying, sparks flashing. Ichabod's flimsy garments fluttered out behind him as he stretched out over the neck of Gunpowder in the eagerness of his flight. They had now reached a part of the road which turned off to Sleepy Hollow, but Gunpowder, rather than keeping up it, made a lateral move, and he plunged headlong downhill to the left. This road leads through a sandy hollow for about a quarter of a mile when it crosses the bridge, famous in goblin story, and just beyond it stands the church. For a moment, the panic of the steed had given his unskillful rider an apparent advantage in the chase. But just as they reached halfway through the hollow, Ichabod felt the girths of the saddle start to give way. He endeavored to hold it firm by seizing it at the pommel, but it was too late, and he had just time to save himself by grasping Gunpowder around the neck when he felt it slip and fall to the earth behind him, where it was closely trampled underfoot. For a moment, the terror of Hans von Ripper's wrath passed through his mind, for it was his Sunday saddle. But this was no time for petty fears. The goblin was on his haunches. And unskillful rider that he was, he had much ado to maintain his seat, sometimes slipping on one side, sometimes on the other, and sometimes vaulted on the high ridge of the horse's back with a violence that he verily feared would cleave him asunder. A parting in the church trees now cheered him with the thought that the church bridge was close at hand. A silver star in the bosom of the brook told him he was not mistaken. He could see the white walls dimly glaring through the trees. "If I can but reach that bridge," thought Ichabod, "I am safe." Just then he heard the panting and blowing of the horse close behind him, and even he fancied he felt his hot breath. Another shower of convulsive kicks to Gunpowder, and he made the bridge. He thundered over the resounding planks and gained the opposite side, only now casting a look behind him to see if the goblin should disappear according to rule in a flash of fire and brimstone. But at that very moment, Ichabod watched as the goblin rose in his stirrups, and in the very act of hurling his head at him, Ichabod endeavored to dodge the horrible missile, but it was too late, and he had just time to save himself. But it was too late, and it encountered his cranium with a tremendous crash, sending him headlong into the dust. And the goblin horse, the horseman, and Gunpowder passed by like a whirlwind. The next morning, the old horse was found, soberly cropping the grass at his master's gate, with the bridle under his feet and without his saddle. Ichabod did not make his appearance that morning at breakfast. Dinner hour came, but still no Ichabod. The students gathered at the schoolhouse, but strolled idly along the banks of the brook, for there was no schoolmaster. Hans von Ripper now began to feel some uneasiness as to the fate of poor Ichabod and his saddle. An inquiry was set out on foot, and after diligent investigation, they soon came upon his traces. At the wide part of the road which led up to the bridge was found the saddle, deeply dented and trampled into the dirt, as if ridden over at furious pace, and just to the other side of the bridge was found the hat of the unfortunate pedagogue, and close beside it, a shattered pumpkin. The brook was searched, but the body of the trooper was not to be discovered. Hans von Ripper, as executor of his estate, examined the small bundle which contained all his worldly effects, which included a history of Cotton Mather's, A History of New England Witchcraft, and a book of dreams and fortune-telling, in which last was a sheet of foolscap, scribbled and blotted with several fruitless attempts at making a copy of verses in honor of the heiress. These magic texts and the poetic scrawl were henceforth consigned to the flame by Hans von Ripper, who determined never again to send his children to school, believing he never knew of any good come of the same reading and writing. The mysterious event caused much speculation on the following Sunday. Knots of gazers and gossips gathered in the churchyard at the gravestones and at the place where the hat and pumpkin were discovered. The tales of Brower and Bones were called to mind, along with a whole budget of others, and when they had diligently compared them with all the symptoms of the current case, they came to the conclusion that Ichabod was carried off by the galloping Hessian. That he was a bachelor and in nobody's debt, no one bothered to say any more about him. The schoolhouse was moved to another part of the hollow, and a new schoolmaster reigned in his stead. It is true that an old farmer returned from a visit to New York several years later with the intelligence that Ichabod was still alive, that he had left the neighborhood partly in mortification at being dismissed by the heiress, and partly in terror of Hans von Ripper and the galloping Hessian, that he had moved his quarters to a distant part of the country, that he had kept up school and studied law at the same time, turned politician, electioneered, wrote for the paper, and eventually became a justice of the 10-pound court. Brom Bones, too, who shortly after his rival's disappearance conducted the blooming Katrina in triumph to the altar, and always seemed to look exceedingly knowing when the story of Ichabod was related, and would burst into a hearty laugh whenever the pumpkin was mentioned, which led some to believe he knew more than he chose to tell. The bridge became more than ever an object of superstitious awe, and that may be the reason why the road has been altered of late, so as to approach the church from the border of the mill pond. The old Dutch wives, however, who are the best judges in these matters, affirm to this day that Ichabod was spirited away by supernatural means. The old schoolhouse, being abandoned, soon fell into decay and was reported to be haunted by the ghost of the unfortunate schoolmaster. And the plowboy, loitering homeward on a still summer evening, can often fancy hearing his voice at a distance, chanting a melancholy psalm tune over the tranquil solitudes of Sleepy Hollow. Thus concludes The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. I want to thank each of you for joining me this evening. I hope you enjoyed the telling. It is a story that I truly, truly enjoy, being set in the history of New York State. And to those of you that did tune in from home, I hope you enjoyed it just as much. Hopefully one day we can do this all in person a bit easier, but until then, everyone have a wonderful Halloween and a blessed Samhain if you recognize it. I thank you all again. I hope you enjoyed it. Have a safe trip home. Thank you.